All right, guys, we've got a fair amount to cover, and I'm conscious that we've pushed some of the most important content a little bit more rushed than I'd like. And so Adrian and I are going to do our best to get through some of the macro stuff as in a more expeditious way today. So forgive us if we're jumping right into the conversation. So we've got Adrian Rawlinson, who's a fellow guru, familiar to most of you. Vice President of Upswing Health, formerly Chief Medical Officer for HIMSS, going to do a little bit of an update for us on COVID. I'm going to summarize some of the economic information and sort of our outlook from a Q4 point of view. And I think one of the things that we're all navigating here in September post Labor Day is what is the next couple of quarters look like, not only from a work point of view but also personally, and kids going back to school, and unfortunately I think a lot more uncertainty than any of us are used to dealing with. We'll go through that hopefully quickly, and that'll hopefully give everyone a little bit of context. Happy to have a conversation about it. And then Bob Meese and Michael Scissons are going to talk a little bit about their best practices, learnings, things that they've taken away so far from operating in this environment, and things that are top of mind for them respectively going forward. And really invite anybody and everyone to join that part of the conversation, and we'll try to elongate that a little bit. And then a real exciting thing to add to the agenda, our newest angel investment into Bansho, and we've got Prannoy, the founder and CEO, here to talk about what's going on in the education space. And then Bob's going to join him and just talking about short form video in particular. I think impacts almost all of our businesses, and some thoughts around user engagement, content creation in short form video. And so that's the agenda. And with that, we'll kick off and hand over to Mr. Rawlinson. So Adrian, you're up.
Okay, thanks. Thanks everyone. Thanks Chris and Meryl for setting this up. I'm going to try and get through these slides pretty quick. So, I mean, some of it is, well known to you. Some of it is a little bit new, and I've tried to highlight some of the interesting things that are happening in the COVID space. So worldwide cases, as we see, are sort of escalating still, very, very close to the 30 million mark. Worldwide deaths also, on the upward trend. Next slide. US cases very close to I think that says 651 5874. This was 3 days ago, so it's even higher than that now. Next slide. Interesting data around some of the extrapolations that people are looking at. If you look at the current projection, that's the middle dotted line. If we start to ease the mandates, rapidly, which some states obviously have done, the red line then takes over. But really interesting is that if we did have a universal masking protocol, nationwide, it's now well proven that would actually reduce and flatten this line, as you can see the green dotted line there, and bring that sort of death rate down fairly substantially. Next slide. If you haven't read this, I would absolutely recommend. This is probably the best article I've read on COVID-19, on the lack of leadership and the problems with the public health system that we need to try and fix, which is a larger project in itself. But there are also, Gawande puts forward some very interesting ideas as how to fix some of the testing protocols and some of the contact tracing, which we are doing minimally in this country. So have a read. Colleges, this is meant to show the sort of, the current discussion about colleges. Some colleges are pretty much out of control here. Unfortunately, kids like to party, and this is producing a lot of hotspots in various college environments. Next slide. I just did a little rundown of, the highest ones. If you look at Alabama here, they have over 4,000 cases with just 17 different schools. If you look at, some of the other, Texas, 6,000 cases with 63 schools. So a really big problem in colleges. Next slide. And some of the colleges are being very proactive here. My son actually goes to University of Arizona, and they're actually testing the dorm sewage, and have actually found COVID in sewage analysis, and so consequently they screened the whole dorm and found a couple of positive cases that way. So it's a very interesting way to look at sort of contact tracing, if you like. Obviously, all well-known risk factors: parties, large gatherings, and now we're seeing suspension of students who violate those rules. You've probably heard about those in the press. Next slide. This is an interesting slide to show you the depth of some of the contact tracing. This is actually from China, from Wuhan. This is actually a bus. If you look at the front, you see the front window of the bus. The left-hand side is the driver, and then all the passengers. And what they did is they looked at what's called an index patient, which is the one in red in the middle, and that's basically the patient who started the spread on this bus. And you can see that, and these people sat in their seats for the whole time, didn't move, and got off the bus straight away after a couple of hours journey. And you can see that the spread is all the way back to this guy C10 at the back of the bus, which makes you wonder about, whether things like airline flights and various other modes of transportation are safe. It would seem that this is, these types of contact studies are proving that the virus is very easily transmitted through the air. And this was an air-conditioned controlled bus with a filter system as well. So interesting. We're not doing this sort of stuff in the US to any great degree that I'm aware of. This is really what we should be doing, is trying to find these mini breakouts, if you like.
And these people were probably wearing masks, right?
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. I can send you the details of the study, but I don't want to get into too much detail because of the time. But it's a very interesting study to look at. Some of the new information about vitamin D is very interesting. I actually started taking a vitamin D supplement about 3 weeks ago. And I think there is some evidence that vitamin D deficiency might play a role in increasing your risk slightly of COVID. I just want to flip to the next slide and show you the results of this study. It would seem that the lower your vitamin D level, the higher that you have a chance of a positive COVID test. So there's a direct correlation there. That's a very simplistic way of looking at it, and there's obviously many different factors. Dietary, exercise, environment, etc., etc. But it's starting to look like there might be a direct correlation between low D and COVID risk. Next slide. Interesting stuff on the vaccine. You may have heard of this. This is something that I was worried about, in that everything is moving so fast. This trial in the UK was actually stopped because of an instance of what's called transverse myelitis, which is a very severe neurological disorder for nerves in the spine that get affected and can produce permanent neurological deficit. So this is something that is worrying, that we're actually rushing too much with these phase 3 trials, with very little animal studies taking place. So you're probably going to see more of this in the next few weeks. So who's going to get this vaccine? Well, certainly, healthcare workers or essential workers, people at increased risk for severe illness, people who are in large group settings, shelters, probably colleges, universities, and people with limited access to services such as rural communities, people with disabilities, or underinsured or no insurance. However, it would seem that the US is probably not ready for it. This is a recent poll taken, and 23% would not take the vaccine at all. 44% would not take the vaccine until others had had it. So, maybe we are rushing this too much and people are just not ready for it. But obviously time will tell. It is 2 shots. It's two different injections, which is, a lot to ask. There's going to be a drop off after 1 shot. If you don't get the second one, maybe you don't build immunity. Who knows? There's a lot of unanswered questions here. Finally, some Some good news about masks, if you like. This is basically showing the trend of mask wearing between June of this year and August. So if you look at the very top line, it's actually gone up significantly from 65% to 85%. And this breaks it down into various different groups. If you look at the very bottom here, the second to last line is basically people who lean Republican, and they started at 53%, and now have gone up to 76%. Democratic voters started at 76%, now they're up to 92%. So we do see an increase across the board, but obviously there's still a lot of work to do. Personally, I think there should be a compulsory mask wearing across the country. If we did that for the next 2 or 3 weeks, we would see a significant decrease in cases, but that's just my opinion. And with that, that was a fast run through of some interesting topics. Any questions, I'm happy to answer, but I will hand it back to Chris.
Thanks, Adrian. Appreciate it. Any questions for Adrian before we get into the economic side of this? All right.
That was great, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll send out the deck to everybody and sort of kind of rush through this stuff. I'm going to go even faster on more content. So there's a lot of talk about a K recovery. If you're not familiar, that just means that those folks with college education in tech type jobs have recovered through the economic impacts of COVID, and those without haven't. There's a thing, though, that I wanted to kind of bring to light, which is what does the K actually look like? And I'll just use the metaphor of the letter, maybe too much, but it looks a lot more like a lowercase K, and maybe even more this style of K, and I'll unpack what brings us to that conclusion. If you look at, from an economic point of view, if you look at the S&P and you take out FANG and you've got 99% of the other stocks that are left, you can see a pretty dramatic impact. Tech's done really well in COVID, a lot of tailwinds for most tech. The rest of the real economy really hasn't. And if you break that out, and picking up on Adrian's slide, if you look at non-college educated US citizens, which is about 80% of our workforce, or another way to look at it, 80% of our households, the unemployment rate there is still very, very, very high. And the main point that I'm trying to get to here is the net impact to the overall real economy, and how things that don't seem to be that bad under the surface start to get a little worrisome. So if you look at the CARES Act, $2.3 trillion injected really into 2 quarters. The US government's now, we talked about this with Bob Posen a little bit in our last session, now 41% of US GDP, highest we've been since World War II, which means there's not a lot of latitude for the government to really bail us out here. Everyone's pretty familiar with how horrific Q2 was, but thanks to the CARES Act, it was somewhat mitigated. The other thing that those of us that are in the US or North America forget is how global the impact of this has been, and probably will continue to be. And so this idea that the US alone is out of control, the rest of the global economy is going to be fine, really isn't the case, aside from China. If you look at the second quarter, the only G7/G8 country to have some growth. If you look at Q4, again, we're looking at another tough quarter, and sort of the last of the CARES Act dollars really kind of mitigating some of the downside here, but with some positive outlook as we get into 2021. But really press, the whole idea on that recovery is based on the vaccine and people taking it, and you saw Adrian's concerns on that front. So what do I mean by the letter K, and why this letter K in particular? If you looked at COVID cases between the poorest in the United States, which is the most disadvantaged, so the lower 20%, from an income point of view versus the highest 20%, the most advantaged. You see that COVID doesn't give a shit, excuse my language, but the populations are getting, equal. Initially it was really the most disadvantaged that were getting hit. That's changing with 40 million jobless claims now, and about 3 to 4 million jobs that seem to be gone and not coming back. We've got some issues that we need to think about going forward. So hate to be kind of putting this in front of you guys today, was not my intent, but if you look at the data, I think it's very easy for us collectively to take a sigh and try to relax a little bit in what happened in Q3 over the summer. But I think the data says we should be doing anything but that going into Q4. So a lot of uncertainty with second wave COVID, with the vaccine, US election uncertainty. Now that the House and Congress has failed to pass any fiscal support, likely none happening before the election. The impact of that is really on 80% of the economy and the population. And so we're going to start to see some dislocation there. That's going to be a lot more tangible than we've seen to date. And I guess the big takeaway is we live in this really tech street privilege bubble, both by education and sector. The difference between what we're experiencing and what Main Street is like to experience in Q4 is going to start to come together. There's just no way for those things to stay uncoupled into the medium term. So that's the non-fun stuff, but I think important that we chat about. Any questions or thoughts on that before we get into some hopefully more fun things? All right, good. Bob, Michael, would love to hear from you guys now that we're sort of nine months into COVID, working remote. What's working, what's not working? What are you guys thinking about looking forward?
I can start, but just to give people a quick background too. I'm at Duolingo. We're the leading language learning app in the world, and just in terms of overall context too. So 2020 has obviously been a crazy year for all of us. Definitely impacted, but we're helped in that we've had tailwinds in our business, and so businesses like Duolingo and online education are the core business is benefiting from the current environment, and I can talk about that. And then another part too is that's our culture is a really important part of our company. We have a really strong in-person culture. We're headquartered in Pittsburgh. We have offices in New York City, Seattle, and Beijing as well too. But we have a really strong headquarters culture here and a really strong in-person office culture, and that's something we've really missed just with this. So those are a couple of things to start with. In terms of productivity and what's working, in terms of getting work done, it's fine. Where that it's largely fine. Is most companies will tell you different groups are impacted differently. Where obviously things are really hard for parents, and we've made a number of accommodations, and I can talk a bit about that. Another group that might be a little bit less obvious too. We do periodic surveys of the company twice annually. We actually just did one, and one employee population that feels like it's struggling or just has a less positive outlook is managers, and that's one. Just having to coordinate so much in this environment where coordination's hard, it feels like they're bearing a big part of the brunt, and so that's a couple populations that are really impacted. For us, another one is around new employees, where we've had strength in the business, and so we've actually we've grown faster during this year in terms of employee growth as a percentage than at any time during my time at the company in the last 4 years, and possibly ever, where we'll add about 70-75% employee growth this year, where historically that number's been kind of 50 or lower, and kind of in terms of absolute numbers, going from about 200 at the beginning of the year to we'll finish at 360 or something like that. And so it creates different stresses on that. We thankfully for us, we'd invested a fair amount of time and energy into the employee onboarding experience prior to all of this, and so we have a lot of executives that are there in terms of welcoming people into the first couple of days and trying to codify more of our culture. And so we're really thankful that we made those investments into the employee onboarding experience, because we think that that's definitely helped. But overall, we do find a bit less connection, where if we kind of score ourselves versus our historic pre-COVID kind of goals in terms of employee connection, we're probably not quite there, but we are just really trying to do everything we can for employees. And so we're scoring quite well. Just when people think about everything that's happening in the world and maybe some friends and people they know in other places, we tend to score well there. So those are some things. And then one, kind of the last part, and then I'll pause for a little bit, is we think about going forward, this will all be different. And we've been pretty focused on having people either work at our headquarters or other offices, but we think into the future, there's just a need for a more flexible work environment. And so we're not going like all remote by any means, right? We think that the in-person culture is important. But for us, when we think about what this looks like at the back end, the Stripe model, in terms of just having another office that is remote and being more thoughtful in terms of how you do that, is something that we're very likely to adopt. And so we haven't yet done that, but we're in the discussion phases, and there seems like a lot of alignment. But what Stripe has done, they've documented it. People should check it out. But that's something that we're very likely to adopt in the future.
Anyone feel free to jump in on questions for Bob. I had one for you, and it was interesting what you're saying about managers in particular being under stress in this environment. Have you thought of ways to mitigate that at all, or how to help that level in organizations deal with the pressures that they're under?
There's one is just around communication and tools. And so there's a lot. We have a Slack channel that's dedicated to managers. We have like a learning and development team that's putting out more content, and just even little things where just it's easy for people to like round down, so to speak, emotionally, where there's if something would be perceived as more positive in person, if you have less context, you kind of perceive it as neutral. And if something would be perceived as neutral when you're in person, people round down with less context and perceive it negatively. And so just some of these kind of heuristics too are just tools or communication channels. And so that is trying to do that, but there's no silver bullet. It's a group that some of these people are new managers as well too. And I think that's particularly hard. But it's a lot around communication and tools is how we've tried to solve it.
Hey, Sam, I was wondering if you could jump in on that similar topic, because I know you've got a distributed organization that you're managing, and multinational too. Are you seeing something similar or not? Yeah, Sam's on mute. Or Dan, I know you've got that issue too.
Sorry, Chris. I'll let Dan go first as well.
All right, I'm here. Can you hear me now, Chris?
Yep, we can.
Well, I had you on double. I had myself on double mute. Game Club is a small team, and we operate across basically 4 locations, and have been doing so since our inception. We are accustomed to working this way. I mean, we do a lot of low-cost game development work in Poland. We do our QA testing in Mexico, which is a facility I've been using for years. And we started the company being headquartered in New York, but with our tech hub in Copenhagen, Denmark. So honestly, we are okay with it, and we could continue for a while. We reopened the Denmark office, but there's only a few people there, and it's pretty much optional. And I think the situation seems a little bit more relaxed. In New York, we are not likely to go back anytime soon, And I don't think it's so much out of paranoia about the work environment. I think New York, it's got a lot more to do with the commute. But for us, it's been more or less, as far as operating procedures, it's been pretty much business as usual since the start of the pandemic. So we're feeling okay about it.
And it doesn't sound like any impacts of duration of this way of working. You guys are just kind of set up to do it.
Yeah, we are set up. We haven't really even discussed yet going back, but I do feel like when we do, it'll probably be kind of an optional approach. But definitely going to look into some of these best practices, including Stripe, to Bob's point, which is good advice, I think.
Yeah, on our side, Chris, similar to Dan's, with Lease, though, we had already created sort of processes around, creating culture for teams that are geographically dispersed. In the U.S., we have, 6 different locations, right? We have teams in 6 different locations. So we have been used to sort of congregating and interacting and measuring performance remotely, and being very thoughtful about celebrating some of those key things to create culture. In fact, I had an all-hands meeting right before this meeting, right, to keep that tradition going. So we've been very intentional about that, which has really helped. And more recently, we opened up an office in Mexico as well, where we continue some of those practices. The team in those locations are still meeting, right? So that hasn't changed with precautions, of course, of wearing masks and so forth. The biggest impact has been in our corporate office, right, where we have our engineering team and some of the other key areas where I think a lot more of the creative discussions and sort of used to take place. I do feel like we've done a decent job in sort of being thoughtful about creating that, sort of exporting that culture virtually, but it has become more difficult. And I think the creative discussions are harder to have, right? You have to be more intentional about them when you're all sitting in different locations versus having a central location where you can congregate and just whiteboard out a certain challenge or problem that you're trying to solve. So long story short, we decided to not renew our lease for headquarter office, right? Because we have been very productive. But I do see the advantages of congregating and coming back, specifically for roles where you're having a lot of these, very creative debates and tackling some very, big problems that you want a lot of creativity in the room. And that's an area that I'm still trying to learn a little bit more about and how to do. But I do see us, coming back to headquarters with some flexibility, of course, around people's needs to try to get more of that out of the operation.
Appreciate both you guys jumping in, and actually, Sam, your point on managing distributed content creation and creativity is probably a great segue to bring Prannoy into the conversation. Prannoy, you want to just talk a little bit about what Bansho is, why you decided to start it, and then we can talk a little bit about these two slides you've got and some thoughts around it.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Chris. So I guess just to add color to the previous discussion, Bansho was created about 2 months ago, late June. We formed as a completely distributed. So we have developers in Toronto, we have marketing in South Carolina, we have a team in New York, and everyone's working from home. So it's really interesting to hear potentially in the next stage of our growth what it looks like. So thanks again for that discussion. So what Bansho is a mobile platform for short form educational learning for 5 to 12-year-olds. I've noticed a few trends which I could talk about on the next slide, but before that, I think the broad idea behind Bansho and inspiration behind it was identifying and seeing this demand from teachers to be influencers in their space, and the amount of content that they were creating with very little with very little payback, frankly, for what they were doing. Where there was so much content available from educators and very few marketplaces that were serving them. And at the same time, we were also noticing, obviously in COVID and pandemic, but also just in general, this deep desire for kids to have educational content that's entertaining and that's also mobile friendly. A lot of educational content now is geared towards tablets and phones, and districts are equipping their entire populations with tablets and phones. So I think obviously that's been a trend that's been very, very clear and transparent. So I think as a former teacher myself, I realized a lot of my teacher friends were putting their classes on YouTube just for their own kids. And some of them went viral because a parent shared it with another parent, and then all of a sudden wasn't necessarily that engaging. So that was kind of the need we saw in the need we saw in the market, and that's kind of what Bansho is about: creating fun, short, educational videos from a network of educators so that kids can watch them on their phones. Yeah, so that talks a little bit about the kind of the three trends that I saw in the marketplace. One, as kind of we all know, even if I don't have any kids, but I know a lot of parents out there who are seeing their kids kind of transition into the virtual learning world. What we're finding is synchronous learning is not necessarily working for the younger ones. They can't sit in front of a laptop or a computer screen for more than, probably 30 to 45 minutes at a time. And the amount of learning that they're doing is really at their table in practice. It's not through these live sessions. So micro learning was a huge trend. Short form content that you can watch at your own time, and then connect with your educators and classmates on discussing it. So that was one thing. So we're an asynchronous platform currently. So we wanted to make sure that all our lessons that are being uploaded are super interactive. It plays like a mobile social media platform. The second, I think, is a trend I mentioned, is teacher shifting roles. So whereas before, before COVID and even up till recently, they were facilitators of content. School districts would license curriculum, teachers would get it plopped on their desk and then have to create something out of nothing, basically. Over time, they took the curriculum and create their own stuff. They create their own things and then sell them on Teachers Pay Teachers, for example, is a marketplace platform where teachers are selling their own curriculum. And now they're getting to be curators. So that's kind of the trend that we are seeing in Bansho, is the ability for educators to kind of own their role as influencers on our market. And then finally, the shift for schools. I think, I'm from a generation where we grew up and my parents outsourced education to the public school system. They were somewhat involved, but they trusted the school system to kind of give me what I needed educationally. This generation and future generations are totally kind of skewing that. And parents' education, they know all their teachers' names. They know how to kind of leverage the system in a certain way. And I'm talking about a particular demographic, obviously. But what we're also realizing is learning happens everywhere. And you see the trend for colleges not accepting SAT scores anymore and not requiring them. And the trend for now for school is actually really about socialization. about experimenting and about learning in that collaborative atmosphere. And all the learning actually takes place somewhere else. The reading and the studying and the practice takes place somewhere else. And then school becomes this environment for experimentation. So I kind of listed a few articles that helped kind of come up with this perspective. Some of them I wrote, some of the trends that I kind of wanted to point out that aren't necessarily always talked about, and also informed Bansho's, thesis, so to speak.
Hey, Bob, I was wondering if I could bring you into the conversation here, because obviously with Duolingo, short form video and education is, very core to the mission, and wondered what you guys were learning in this environment, and has it changed much? Obviously your business is accelerating in some really interesting ways. Just curious if there were some takeaways.
Sure. For us, we serve people of all ages, and so Duolingo users are anywhere from, you need to be able to read, so I don't know, it starts around 5 years old, and then hundreds-year-olds can use our product. We are mainly an adult learning product, but we do certainly serve schools, and so we've K-12 in particular can be hard, and so we have stayed away from it a little bit, but I will say that the changes that are happening in K-12 education are actually causing us to reassess and figure out how we can address and how we can help. And so for this, we have a strong preference to not sell to schools. We would just, the less that we need to get directly involved with districts, the better, because it just feels impossibly slow. And so just maintaining more of our consumer culture is a very, very strong preference that we have. But at the same time, there just is an obvious need. And so we haven't yet figured out exactly what we're going to do about that. But we, including from our CEO, Luis, like who doesn't even have kids. And then those of us, who are parents like myself, there's this need. And so we're trying to figure out how we can create a new offering within Duolingo, or what we can do to change to better serve the K-12 market, but do it in a way where it's more direct to consumer.
Hey, Bob, just to unpack that, when you say you haven't focused on that market, is it an economic issue, or is it actually the content you have to deliver and how the K-12 learns differently than sort of the balance of your population?
It's multiple issues. And so one is, the app stores are certainly imperfect, and there's a lot of discussion and challenge with that, but it is pretty amazing from a distribution perspective that we're able to get access to the number of people we do without any real salespeople and just at the app store. And so there's that part, right? We've developed great DNA around software development and design and other things. We don't have a great DNA around like selling to schools is one. And then another from like the learning perspective, we do offer a product, and we've looked at schools. We have our own Duolingo curriculum. We think that if we were to really seek much greater adoption in schools, do we need to align to somebody else's curriculum, or just from a curriculum perspective, we haven't been able to like quote unquote like own the curriculum in world language and foreign language in a lot of K-12, and so that has been an impediment. Duolingo can still be used, but a lot of the use cases, like we actually have a lot of usage by schools, but we don't monetize it at all. And the most common use case is not integrated into the curriculum, but it's more around like extra credit, or it's actually quite fun. It's actually interesting how the teacher that introduces Duolingo can be the cool teacher, because they're just, students tend to have a favorable reaction to it, but it's actually kind of disconnected from a lot of the core curriculum.
Yeah, I think Bob brought up a great point, which I think should also be it is definitely another trend in ed tech, especially now. A lot of the ed tech startups that are getting funding are going direct to parents, and that's a huge shift in the market, where when you think ed tech, you think, oh, the margins are basically enterprise software where you sell to districts. And the reality is the go-to-market now has really, that framework has completely disintegrated, because what Bob mentioned is so true. Is selling to districts is such a slow sales cycle and so hard. But when you validate your product with the market, with parents or with teachers, that eventuality to potentially like converting an enterprise sale. But again, the barriers are really hard. Matching to curriculum and dealing with state standards and national standards and making sure it all aligns. It's a mess. So direct to consumer is definitely where a lot of education technology is going.
I'd love to kind of bring Dan into that conversation. Game Club, obviously, is trying to navigate to that same buyer, for parents, is a big segment for your customers, and video is also a big part of short form video is a big part of discovery. I'm just kind of curious how I want to pick up on Bob's thought about the App Store. If we're all trying to get that parent to buy, whether or not it's Duolingo or Bansho or Game Club, how's that going? What have you learned about sort of the different challenge of getting through the App Store in particular? And with iOS 14 in front of us, probably pushed off a little bit, it looks like, till January, but still, Apple and Google really kind of controlling, those access points.
Our experience, and our product, I think, is coming at things from a pretty different angle. Game Club is a platform that has been built and ultimately will be for everyone, including parents and kids. But our early adopters are not parents and they're not kids. So in part because we haven't yet populated our library with the right kind of content, even though I would love nothing more than to do that. And for instance, there are some really fantastic kids educational games. They're games first, but they happen to be educational. For instance, Originator, they make games like Endless Alphabet and stuff, which literally taught my daughter how to spell and read and stuff in a super fun way. The only way that those types of games are going to be able to make money is through multi-game subscription. And that is what I would call phase 3 of Game Club. But phase 2 of Game Club, which is the one we're entering right now, is much more about core games on mobile device, which is appealing to males in their 20s and 30s. So I think, Bob and I have talked about a lot about the subscription model, and we're learning a lot from Duolingo. But I don't think we're really in a super relevant space to be attacking parents just yet, even though it's been proven in studies that multi-game subscription is the number one most the number one model for parents as far as like how they would most prefer games to be monetized.
It sounds like maybe for similar reasons that Bob stayed away from that K-12 market. There's just the economics of the other segments of your business are just easier to go execute against right now. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Netflix, by the way, not a lot of folks realize this, but the kids' content, the family content, first of all, some of it is fantastic. And secondly, it actually is one of the top 5 reasons, if not the top 3 reasons, why people subscribe to Netflix. But just think about, like, you're aggregating a library for everybody. Think about the billions that Netflix has put in to that investment, and then consider the Game Club has raised less than $5 million. We'll get there, but we have to build on the heels of the low-hanging fruit, which is core gamers that want to play core games on their phone. And we have great traction with that right now, and we're doing very well in locking down that content and deploying it on our platform inexpensively.
And obviously, Prannoy, that's a big part of what you guys are doing in terms of getting teachers as both creators and curators of content, in terms of getting content that works, but also presumably at lower cost, but with less control over it. And Bob's model is, he kind of controls content and the curation of it pretty tightly. Just kind of curious how you guys are thinking about it, because, if I look horizontally, whether or not it's, Ko Kim, which she's doing at Even Prime, or what Julie and Renee are doing with Gentrio, or even Game Club, a lot of folks are trying to figure out ways to create short form videos for people to understand their products and experience them. And that's both expensive and, tough to make sure that you're hitting the mark.
Yeah. So obviously a huge inspiration was, right. Like, I think the content delivery model of TikTok, we noticed was getting really huge in the vertical of education. So I was reading an article probably 3 or 4 months ago about how there, 35 million followers of educational content on TikTok. But these TikTok creators aren't necessarily monetizing on anything. TikTok's ad platforms isn't as robust as YouTube's. And so a lot of the TikTok educators who are classroom teachers or just really fun, like entertaining people, can't really get to their audience in the way that they want to on TikTok. First of all, 5 to 12-year-olds are kind of forbid from using TikTok because of obvious reasons, from a parenting standpoint. And so identified in that vertical of TikTok was potentially getting in early and getting educators off TikTok, or at least getting them to diversify their content delivery to another platform like Bansho, which gets them direct to the consumers that they're kind of building for already. And so in that sense, our content acquisition has actually been fairly cheap. First of all, we're working with people who have part or full-time jobs as educators and do this for fun and for like their passion and impact. So, and we're also able to really curate the content. So we reject teachers. This is not like a user-generated content model. We meet our teachers, we get them on board, we onboard them, and they're part of the community. And if they're not creating the right content, so we have a little bit of flexibility there, at least I'm learning, which has been really nice. And especially with what has happened with TikTok in the past couple months in terms of their privacy concerns, their global political concerns, a lot of educators have jumped ship, or at least have jumped to look for other options.
Hey, Bob, I know it was one of the theses you guys had at Duolingo, but was one of the things that was tough to pull off was sort of the social or more group learning. Wondering if that's changed at all, sort of as we're sort of deeper into COVID, or if that's still one of the challenges.
It's something we keep coming back to. We definitely haven't cracked it yet, but now we're just wondering if social or group should just be in one of those, in the category of stuff we just refuse to fail at. And so whether we just need to keep coming back to it. And there's a couple of things that we're doing where one is around what I mentioned earlier around early stage thoughts around what more of like a schools or K-12 groups thing would look like. And so that's one that would be just from the ground up new. And then there's other things where in our core business, we've added a variety of social features over the years, most of which failed for a while. But the thing that actually started to work for us is last year we introduced a leaderboard, and there it's just the way that we do it. We we kind of cohort people in the right way, and we basically group people who have similar levels of engagement with our product, and we've found that that's been motivating for people. And there, the first way that we integrated that was pretty basic, but now that it's working, a lot of what we do well is find something that's working and then just like iterate. And so now we're working on like a profile, and we're working on some other things. And so we're kind of attacking like social or groups from a couple different angles, and the one is actually working, and then the other has a lot of energy around it as well too. So I expect that's something that we'll continue to put resources into.
Bob, Prannoy, and maybe to a lesser extent, Dan, one last question for you guys. iOS 14, any sort of hacks / concerns or thoughts on that being a big issue or not a non-issue right now for you guys?
Seems like an issue. It seems like Apple and Facebook are fighting, and the smaller developer companies in the middle are the collateral damage. And so that's because Facebook's like whatever, like Facebook Audience Network's a small part of our business, so maybe we'll just shut it down. So it feels like a real issue. We feel we expect that there's a couple different angles to it. One is around ad monetization, and the other primary one's around performance marketing. Ad monetization, we will be affected. We're just thankful that our core business is subscription, and ad monetization is meaningful but a lot smaller. And so as we start to forecast for 2021, we're definitely taking a haircut to our forecast for ad monetization, specifically on iOS for Facebook. And then the other then is around performance marketing. We're earlier there, but we've spoken to a number of companies there. People are figuring out Apple's SK ad network, and I guess it's not terrible. You'll get a lot less granular information, but I guess you still can report at the campaign level. So what we're seeing is people are poking around with SK ad network, and that's an angle on it. And then with regards to IDFA and the restrictions around that, the general trend is that opt-in rates will be a lot lower. And it kind of depends on the category you're on, but it's anywhere from like 20 to 40% kind of opt-in is what we're hearing. And there, when you have a lot less coverage in terms of the IDFA association with your population, basically what most companies are doing is going earlier funnel, just so that you have more events that are happening. And so while a lot of companies have been going closer to purchase event in terms of what they were really focused on as a primary metric, how we're thinking about things and how other companies that we're speaking with, they're kind of going earlier funnel just to get enough events such that if you have a lower coverage with IDFA, you'll still have some kind of measurement over your performance marketing.
I would love to have the problems that Bob's talking about. I'm still submitting the App Store.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to what Bob said. I think it's relevant for us, minus the part about ad monetization, because we don't monetize that way. We monetize through subscription, similar to Duolingo, which I think is a great business model to be in, and it's been driving a lot of the growth of the App Store. It's actually been outpacing in-app purchases in games in terms of pure growth rate over the last few years of the App Store. And I guess my perspective is one where through my last startup, Tilting Point, we just learned to constantly adapt to the world of paid user acquisition. In my experience, there's never been a business that evolves more quickly or in a more sophisticated way than performance marketing. And I'm just accustomed to constantly evolving there. And I don't think there's a real panic around that. Maybe some companies are in a panic about the changes with IDFA and stuff. From my perspective, advertisers always figure out a way to work around it, and we're all using more or less, we're all the same basic limitations as far as information, and we're all just competing against each other for users. So I think the market will adapt, as it always has. And as far as Apple being a pain in the ass, we're really used to that too. So, I mean, we've been through and overcome much bigger challenges with Apple and their various versions of the App Store and iOS. So we're not phased by any of this.
The elephants will be fighting. I think Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Apple. We're all going to have to be mindful of not getting stepped on as they're dancing around over the next year trying to extract more economic value. But I appreciate the thoughtfulness of the answer and the transparency of the answer. I love this slide, Prannoy, just because I think every company in the portfolio, in a way, is thinking about these different issues about how do I create more engaging content to help people discover and use our products, and how to do that cost effectively and with high engagement. Something we're all learning. So I'd love to kind of come back to this topic another time. But welcome to the family here at Breakaway, Prannoy. Excited to have you as the newest investment and community member.
Appreciate it. It's great to be here. Would love to talk more about education. So feel free to reach out. I'm always available to talk about that stuff.
And Bob, Dan, and Sam, thank you guys for taking the time and for the dealing with my cold calls. I know they weren't necessarily expected.
Thank you for calling us out and organizing this, Chris.
So I'll just finish up quickly. I think we're still on this. There's too much uncertainty to push the accelerator down. So keep an eye on your cash. Just a quick shout out before we end. A big shout out to Dan and the Game Club team, now on both the app stores for both Google and Apple. So the only subscription gaming platform to do that. It was a huge accomplishment, big milestone for the business. Senso and Sarup landed their $3 million pre-Series A deal with 6 new investors in the middle of COVID since we spoke last, which got that announced, which is awesome. And probably the biggest news, Ninth Decimal getting acquired and merged in with InMarket, now over $100 million business, throwing off 15 million of EBITDA, and really not an exit for us, but definitely a combination into a much stronger company, as that space consolidates. So very tricky thing to pull off, as all of you guys would expect in this kind of environment. So congrats to them. And last shout out on the bottom here. I know Dan and Bob Meese have been talking. Sarup and Sam from Listo have been talking. Renee's been talking. Continue to work with each other. Leverage the community, guys. If there's anything we can do to bridge things, more than happy to do it. Thanks for spending the time. Stay safe, calm, kind, and awesome. And we'll be back with you guys in a month. Thanks for taking the time today.